Okay, so today's target is to turn this drawer into a tile organiser. At the moment, my husband's ties are just hanging like this and they keep falling off. It's not just going to be for the ties, but also for the few belts that he does own. I want them to be in the drawer so they're all laid out. He can see exactly what he has. So the idea is that I'm going to add some dividers so that they're kind of square capsules. In here, it'll probably be kind of, yeah, I think 3. So one here, one there, one there. And then I'm not going to make it further than the bit at the back. So it will stop here because you can't reach at the back here. It does mean you lose a little bit of space, but I'd rather lose space than have things disappearing at the back of drawers where they're not going to get used. So I'll have a whole load of little capsules in here and sections. And what I'm going to be using for that is these bits of wood. My husband has cut these up for me. I don't like using the mitre saw. The sound just freaks me out. So I let him do that. I still need to sand down the edges. You can see they're very, very rough. And when this was stored in the shed, it was just an offcut from another project we were working on. It got a little bit bowed. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to sand them, then I'm going to measure everything out, cut it so that they slot together, and then once they've slotted all together and I've got the measurements right and I know it looks fine in the drawer, I'm going to paint them white. First thing I did is sanded down all the edges. I wasn't too careful with this just because I knew that when I painted over it later on, if there were any kind of divots in the wood, the paint was going to cover that up. I just didn't want any of the little splintery edges sticking out. So I sanded all of those down, and once they were done, I needed to measure everything up and cut it to the right size. For the length, I only needed 2 pieces which were 26 centimeters long, so I marked that out on the wood and then cut it down to size. I couldn't find a ruler anywhere, so I used a bracket that was lying around. I know it's not exactly the most professional looking thing, but you know what, it did the job and I didn't have time to go look for the ruler. So I just used that, marked everything out and then cut it down to size. Next, I needed to measure out the pieces that were going to go across. For this, I didn't use a measuring tape, I just put the wood across, marked it, and then cut that down. This part is going to go at the back, and I'll be using some wood glue to stick this down. And then I cut 2 new pieces, which would go across the middle. Once that was done, the edges needed sanding. I'd run out of the normal sandpaper, so I just used a spare piece from the electric sander, and that did the trick just fine. And after that, I took a spare piece of wood, I marked it right in the middle, and then used that as a guide to figure out the notches that I was going to need to cut. Again, I'm sure anyone who does woodworking professionally is going to look at this and want to smash their head into a wall. But I'm dyslexic, I avoid numbers like the plague, so I wing it like this, and you know what? It works. Once they were all marked out, I used a junior hacksaw to cut them down. I couldn't cut across the bottom part, so I just cut down the sides. Once those were both done, I then took a little wood carving knife that I had normally used for wood carving, and I just used that to cut out the very bottom. Some parts came out just in one go, and others I had to really press into it. They slotted together quite well, but the annoying thing is because the wood was slightly bent, because it had been lying at an angle in the shed, it did take a bit of pressing to get it into place. So one of the things I did overnight is I just laid them out completely flat, got some clamps, put them against a piece of wood, and then used that to try and bend them back into shape. By morning, they hadn't flattened out as much as I'd hoped. They had flattened out a little bit, but they weren't completely flat, especially the longer pieces. At this point, I could probably have left them for another day or 2. They would have flattened out a lot more if I'd done that, but to be honest, it just wasn't worth the time. I wanted to finish the project so I could get started on making the dividers for my drawer. And I just started painting it, and you know what, it worked. It didn't have to be perfect, it just had to be perfect enough for us. After about an hour or 2 of painting all the various pieces of wood and waiting for them to dry, I just wanted to stick the back panel. I figured if it ever came loose, then I could screw it in or even nail it in, but I didn't think it would be getting that much abuse that it would come loose, and wood glue wouldn't do the trick. So I just used wood glue at the very back to stick it down, and then cleaned up the edges where some of it had just been squeezed out. Then I took a smaller paintbrush, and any little areas that I'd missed, I just painted those completely. There were a few bits down the middle that I'd missed, so I just took 20 minutes or so to go over with a very small paintbrush and make sure that everything looked neat. And that's it, I'm done. If you like my content and want to follow me on Patreon, that's where you can find my early content, extra content, and see the thought process behind things like my books, cover designs, videos, and artwork. You can also find me on Instagram, but the best place to follow me and make sure that all my new content is sent directly to you is through my website and the mailing list. On the top right hand corner, you put your name, the email you want your new content to be sent to, and that's it, you're done.